University of Delhi for their participation in today's webinar. We are more than grateful to you for this overwhelming response. Women's history and their movements see themselves garnering more importance, and for good reason. Women in India, as I'm sure all of us know, have been systematically and critically marginalized for a considerable amount of time. It is incumbent upon us, students and academics alike, to keep learning and informing ourselves to effect greater change in the status quo. This very need makes today's session even more pertinent, for it is a step towards learning, understanding, and appreciating the women of India, their arduous journey towards self-realization and empowerment, one that is alive even today. With combined efforts of the IQAC, the Department of English, and Nimbus, the English Debating Society of ARSD College, we proudly present to you a webinar on the history of women's movement in India. Before we begin, I would like to extend a token of gratitude to Dr. Vinita Tooley, the IQAC convener, for her constant support to this initiative. I would also like to express gratitude on behalf of the organizing committee to our patron, Honorable Principal Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha. Professor Gyantosh Kumar Jha, who with more than 30 years of experience as an academician and academic leader, is the fifth principal of ARSD College. A fine scholar with several books and research papers to his credit, he has covered significant milestones. His dynamic leadership has constantly motivated faculty and students for all their projects and has always been the pillar of strength for all our endeavors. Due to an emergent meeting with the Vice Chancellor, Principal Sir could not join the webinar, although we expect his presence as the event moves ahead. Now, I would like to invite our event coordinator and teacher in charge of the English department at ARSD College, Dr. Shubha Dwivedi.
Thank you, Rahul. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. A warm welcome to one and all, my colleagues from different colleges of Delhi University and other institutions of the country, my colleagues from ARST College, and students, researchers, academicians from various institutions and organizations. Thank you very much for your enthusiastic response. And we are truly overwhelmed. In fact, we are missing our principal sir here. He would have felt overjoyed seeing the participation of so many for this webinar, for this interdisciplinary webinar that we are organizing today. Friends, today's webinar is an attempt towards interdisciplinary learning, which we want our students to be able to, so that our students are able to make connections between ideas and concepts across different disciplines and boundaries. As expected, today's event has a heterogeneous mix of audience. Students, researchers, academics from art, science, commerce, and social sciences are participating in today's webinar, and I welcome each one of them. We are grateful for their presence and participation. On behalf of ARSD family, I welcome Professor Indu Agnihotri, who very kindly agreed and accepted our invitation to be here to speak to our students. And she is a former director of the Center for Women's Development Studies. And I'm confident that her extensive deliberation is going to benefit students and faculty alike. Friends, we are eternally grateful to the women who fought for our rights. In today's webinar, as we set out to talk about feminist solidarity, collective action that challenged inequality, subordination of women, and status quo, we are also going to acknowledge the long struggle by the women of different generations and nationalities, at the end of which we have been able to receive equal rights, right to education, right to work, and a right to vote. The solidarity and cohesive force of women's movement has led to broad employment for women at more equitable wages, access to higher education, career choices, evolution of reproductive rights, and above all, most importantly, a life of dignity and grace. In order to know more about the contribution, achievements, as well as failures of women's movements in India, I now invite Dr. Indu Agnihotri, who by balancing the roles of the researcher and a committed activist has been a colossal influence in the field of women's studies. She has numerous publications to her name, national as well as international, and she combines rare intellect with commendable grace. And we are extremely indebted to you, ma'am, for accepting our invitation and for joining us today. And we truly look up to you. And I'm sure that, many of us would find inspiration in your lecture and also your interventions in the field of gender studies. Thank you so much. And now over to you, ma'am. Indu, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. You're audible.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, ARST College, the organizers of this program, and Shubha personally, because I think she has pursued this matter very diligently. And a big thank you to all the participants for showing an interest in such difficult times in a subject which seems to be all over the place, and yet we don't seem to be moving ahead on it. As Shubha rightly said, that we really owe a lot to previous generations. And I think that point cannot be hammered again and again without adding that while every generation feels that their lives and their times are difficult, I think if you have a sense of history and a sensitivity to how difficult times were and how difficult past times were, I think then you will understand that if these women who are our foremothers in a sense and our forefathers who fought alongside, if they had not focused on the issues they did, if they had not taken the campaign for rights and for recognition of women's rights as an agenda, I think we would have been in much more difficult circumstances. So thank you. Thank you for your warm words of welcome and introduction. I'll begin with several caveats because the topic that we have is so vast that it is very, very difficult to cover such a vast topic. I've recently delivered 4 lectures for Delhi University Women's Studies Center, and I found even 4 were not enough. So all I'm saying is I've also spent more than half my life trying to dig out material in the archives, etc. And I feel that if I had another life, I would still be doing the same. There is so much in the archives, there is so much in records, in the past materials that we have as sources. I, of course, come from a training in history, so I draw upon that much more. But as Shubha rightly said, that women's studies and the approach to women's rights is based on an interdisciplinary understanding, both in terms of discipline and in terms of strategies on the ground, the multiple strategies and alliance building. These are some of the challenges as well as persistent features that we find in the women's movement. So the first caveat I want to say is that it is too vast a topic to cover. Also vast because of the diversity of this country. Any generalization we make has to be qualified, because to say that women's condition is pathetic can very well be argued against. To say no, women in India have gone very far ahead also. So there is a diversity. There is a diversity also because women and the category of women, as we always say, is not a homogeneous category. It never has been. So when we look at the category of women or gender, we have to understand that while there is materiality and a physicality to the category of women, and which is common to all women in terms of gender based and gender specific discriminations, exclusions, oppression also to some extent, or vulnerability to that oppression. Nevertheless, because women are rooted or grounded or located in different social classes, different castes and communities, different regions, between, say, what used to be the first world and third world countries, etc., etc. So that diversity also adds to the category of women and the complexity that we encounter when we try to understand the forms and nature and extent of oppression and discrimination that women face. Another point that we need to keep in mind is that within India also women live in different conditions. So the condition of women in, say, areas which are inhabited by tribals, Adivasis, which are also usually in our country, as we know, the more backward regions, they may be rich in resources, and yet they are backward in terms of development indices, in terms of the state's reach of welfare schemes, benefits, and rights, etc. There may be diversity in terms of the level of development, in terms of urban development, industrialization patterns. Some regions may be more agriculture oriented with concentration of the agrarian economy. There may be remote regions with issues of connectivity which may be at multiple levels, like the Northeast, for instance, or you may have political context, such as in Kashmir. So there is a diversity, and the oppression and exclusion women face overlaps with some of these, what we call, I mean, a current term is intersectionality, but I find from my discipline, I find there are overlapping concerns, overlapping agendas and challenges which emerge from uneven levels of development in society and women's location within these different locations. Within communities also there is differentiation, or even communities are not homogeneous. So we need to keep that in mind also, that plus I think more so in our country, more so in present times, unlike what we would have anticipated, belonging or coming from a particular religion may place you differently vis-a-vis both the socioeconomic indicators as well as maybe perceptions of political rights, etc. Now, these are all issues which can be debated and discussed, but we need to understand that there are differences and differentiation within communities as well as within regions, and of course between countries with our history. The overwhelming reality when we look at women's condition in India, and if we look at it historically in terms of past, I am going to focus mainly on the women's movement. Now, what I would like to distinguish is between resistance and movements. There is a very, very long history of women's resistance, but resistance and women's movement, as we see it or understand it, write about it, try to enter into a discussion and recall a narrative of history, they are two different things. So we can see resistance, say from ancient times, we can see resistance in the form of bhakti movement, etc., and women's voice within that articulation of women's voice and concerns in that. But when we are talking about the movement, we are talking about an organized struggle, organized activity for change. Here we also need to understand what we mean when we say women's movement. So apart from this distinction between resistance and histories of resistance and the history of the women's movement, we also need to look at how we understand a movement. How do you so you look in terms of both spontaneity but also organized, contemplated agendas and aspirations for change around certain slogans, it may be around certain demands with some common objectives. There may be activism and activity around those demands and agendas. For instance, there may be memoranda submitted, there may be deputations to the authorities, there may be action programs, militant action programs on the streets, there may be pamphleteering, slogans, wall writing, and we have seen a lot of all that in the women's movement in India. At the same time, when we look at a movement, we always have to look at or try to reflect on the social groups, the participants, where do they come from, what is their social location, what is the level of organization building, what are the ideological sort of perspectives which emerge, and there may be multiplicity. The women's movement in India right from the start has seen a diverse picture in terms of forms of organization, in terms of relationship with power, authority, and the state, as well as in terms of drawing its leadership, etc. However, as I said, unlike what is often argued, written about, or even perceived, that there are no sources and documents, etc., to do a history, that is not true. There are different kinds of sources, and we have to learn to interpret and read the sources and documents in different ways. So there is a lot of material, and we see that material very categorically from the second half of the 19th century. Students of history and social sciences in general have dug up over the last 70, 30 years, unlike when we were students to begin with. In fact, there was no reading material, not much reading material around women's issues, reflected in my own discipline. But from the late 70s onwards, we have seen this situation change. In fact, now we have a lot of material. It may not always be women specific. So you may look at it in terms of larger set of documents. You may look at it in terms of newspapers, print media, print culture that develops particularly in the first half of the 20th century, by the 1920s, 30s. We may also, similarly, when we talk of the women's movement, we must also understand that women's movement and women's mobilization around their demands doesn't happen in isolation of other social movements, articulation. So of course, for the movement in India, the starting point in a sense is a longer and broader history and context of imperialism and feudalism in our country, power being concentrated in rural India in the hands of the landlords, the landed classes, the aristocracy, the princely states, which were by and large in collaboration and cahoots with imperialism, and the larger overbearing reality of colonial rule, the British power, which would not be even willing to consider negotiation of power and rights with Indians per se, men or women, and which in a sense denied citizenship. So your status as a subject nation it is only with the growth of the political movement and expression of political aspirations by the Indian people that any kind of a discussion begins on rights in the particularly in the domain of politics. And it is through that women also begin to assert, become visible in the political domain. First, for instance, you will find, apart from apart from political struggles, but also in electoral politics, for instance, in local self-government around the time of the First World War, around that time when local bodies are set up after the Morley-Minto reforms primarily. So it is with that political history that the emergence of platforms where women may express and articulate their own needs, their own interests, concerns that we see. And of course, it expands. We have both organizations which emerge, and I'll briefly mention just a few. It's not possible to list out all. From the early 1900s, we see organizations like the Bharat Stree Mahamandal, which Sarla Devi was involved with, as well as several others. There's the Arya Mahila Samaj, of course, which Pandita Ramabai was associated with for a long time. There was an organization of Parsi women, then the Anjuman-e Khawateen-e Muslimin, which Gail Minow talks about at great length. Region or province-based, town-based committees, Mahila Samitis of women. So you have Gujarat Stri Sabha, you have the Tezpur Mahila Samiti, you have the Assam Pradesh Mahila Samiti, which TMS then merges it, and the Prayag Mahila Samiti, for instance, which people like Rameshwari Nehru, Mahadevi Verma were associated with. And then, of course, from 1917 onwards, we see a very clear emergence of national level organizations. Firstly, the Indian Association, then the National Council for Women in India, and the All India Women's Conference. Subsequently, the Mahila Atmaraksha Samiti, the Women's Self-Defense League in Punjab, etc. And various other samitis. Bengal, for instance, had various district level samitis which were set up by Saroj Nalini Dutt, etc. Then there were state level organizations. So there was Andhra Mahila Sabha and Andhra Mahila Samaj. There was the Vanita Samaj in Delhi from the 40s. Definitely we see Saheli Samaj, Saheli Sabha. And a lot has been written around this. Some of them, I believe, are mentioned in your course at the graduate level. Radha Kumar's book is there, Moitri Chaudhry's book is there. Apart from more specific organizational histories, say by Aparna Basu, by Renu Chakravarti, by Gargi Chakravarti, herself associated with Delhi University, Manikuntala Sen, Vandana Sonalkar and Meenakshi Moon, and of course Urmila's book is there listed in your readings also. So it's a vast array, and all of them had different orientations, different locations. The WIA, with its office located in the Theosophical Society office in Tamil Nadu, in Madras at that time, and now Chennai, where Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins, Dorothy Jean Rajdas, all these were also associated politically with the Home Rule League. So there is a political affiliation as well as a broader Theosophical Society location. And WIA, in fact, hands over the first two memoranda to the Viceroy in India, and they actually take a deputation in 1917. So the first memoranda is on the whole issue of indentured labor, and the second one, of course, is the more well-known, which raises the issue of education for women and political rights, the right to vote in 1917. So this is gradually we see a more clear articulation. But articulation of demands is already coming up, or the concerns is reflected in, say, the bulletins, the publications of these various organizations. You have Sri Dharma, you have Sri Darpan from Allahabad. You have, of course, then when the AIWC set up, so their bulletin also, Roshni, and which is still there. So there is a vast array, and there are very big names. All of you would know some of those names. I will not take more time on that. The culmination of some of this we see at two levels. One is in the Constituent Assembly, when the Constitution of India is being negotiated, drafted, and discussions are happening. And of course, then the Constitution itself. So that is broadly the history in terms of the pre-independence period. The Constituent Assembly debates are very rich in discussions. A few things I'll just mention. There's a fair amount of debate on women's education. Firstly, there is a clarity and there is a consensus that women will have equal rights. In fact, the reason and this promise of equal rights allows for women to not ask for reservation in the political domain. I mean, Renuka Ray makes a clear statement saying the women's movement in India does not ask for reservation or any special treatment. That statement, in a sense, is located in this hope belief, conviction that independent India will not only promise, but realize equality for women. Where we are with that, we can discuss. There is, for instance, Hansa Mehta, who very categorically says that there is no question of a separate kind of curriculum, separate goal for women's education, that there must be equality in the field of education at all levels. So both in terms of specific domains as well as the whole negotiation of rights of citizenship, women are very directly pitched and pitted at the level of equality, and which is visible also, it's reflected in the fundamental rights resolution. There is debate, of course, there are different viewpoints even within the Constituent Assembly. There's Dakshayani Velayudhan, for instance, who makes a very, very strong statement about untouchability, and also equally about economic sort of domain in terms of exploitation, bondage, forced labor, etc. And specifically with experience from the Dalit community. Dakshayani, you must remember, was the only Dalit woman, and very young. She was in her early 30s when she's debating all this in the Constituent Assembly. So that is where we are. There are different viewpoints in terms of, for instance, there are tensions, intentions, or points of negotiation which we still see, for example, in terms of individual rights, community rights. Now, community rights may involve religion, or they may involve communities in terms of tribals, etc. So there are debates around that aspect also, and the Constituent Assembly debates are available on the internet, so you are all welcome to read. It's a very, very rich history. And what I would say is two things. One, that these women were there were 15 women in the Constituent Assembly in their own right as women, not necessarily and not at all because they were proxy. Why I'm saying it is because all debate and discussion about women's political representation today gets caught into this whole notion of proxy. These women had come through long histories of active participation in all struggles at different levels, and they were there in their own right, on their own merit, whether it was Amu Swaminathan, whether it was Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who addressed the UN General Assembly, whether it was Hansa Mehta, who was responsible for the having the word human rather than man, and she insisted that man should be replaced with human, or Dakshayani Velayudhan, or Amu Swaminathan, Renuka. The list is endless, and there's no time, so I will not talk about all those at great length. The other thing that we find is, for instance, while this history of women's activism around what we today see as specifically women's rights is slightly more well known today. It has been written about and researched over a long time now. Nevertheless, what we often fail to see is that women, be it in colonial India or in present times, that women are not just sort of biologically female beings. They have an existence. They have an existence as farmers, peasants, landless laborers, as workers. And this was the history from colonial times. So when we look at women, and women were also participating in a very, very big way from the non-cooperation movement times. I mean, although first participation we see visibly in the Swadeshi movement in Bengal, and Sumit Sarkar has written about that. But from the time of the First World War and the whole Gandhian movement, the advent of mass movements in the Gandhian leadership, we find that women are, I mean, it's not a few women, it's not a sprinkling. Women are there in all the struggles, in all mass movements that take place, including the very, very militant mass movements of peasants in the 1940s. You will, for instance, find whether it's Telangana, Tebaga, the Worli struggle, the Kartwib, any of the peasant movements, you will find women. Why I'm saying that is because there is a false understanding, I would say. Sometimes our academics make statements based on their understanding and their in-depth work. But when we take those statements, we reproduce them in such a mechanical fashion. Why I'm mentioning this is we all know Partha Chatterjee has made a very detailed, very intricate, complex argument about the women's question in the period of in the colonial period. It's there in his piece in the volume edited by Kumkum Sangari and Sudesh Ved in Recasting Women, but it is also there in his own book where those two chapters are the women and the nation and the nation and its women. Now, he has made a particular argument in a particular context. But that is interpreted to mean that, oh, women were living their lives only in the private domain, therefore sources are not available. I'm asking you this, if some of you are students of social sciences, do you think colonialism and British imperialism gave women the luxury to lead their lives? I mean, the mass of women to lead their lives in the private domain? You think they were not out on the fields struggling day in, day out, where the maximum level of exploitation in British India is that is in the domain of agriculture, which is where women are associated directly in the economy. Women are, I mean, if we fail to recognize women's role in the agrarian economy, then we are doing a big disservice to the women of India, because till the last census, the larger majority of women were in the rural economy, in the agrarian economy in rural India. It is only in 2011 that we find that, in fact, that women are losing out on agrarian and economic resources, that a very distinct shift happens to urban India. A migration happens. So let us not, take statements and arguments presented by some of our social scientists mechanically. I'm saying it because for years I had to correct scripts by students of mine who would say, there's you won't find women's material on women in the archives. No, you will. I'm telling you, there is tons and tons of material. I think we've only begun to scrape the surface. So that is one thing. And that is why you have to look in other movements also. So apart from women's specific demands, you have to look in other movements. Sometimes historians would have written about it. Sometimes historians may have not written about it. And we have to ask those questions, which is what women's studies began to do from the 1970s, saying, how can you write a history without recognizing and reflecting on women's role, contribution, status, their demands, their issues, their experiences? And that questioning from the women's studies perspective is pervasive across all disciplines. And I think it has resulted in much more vigorous inquiry, rigorous inquiry, and it has contributed to a lot of new material, new insights, and new questions, new intellectual questions being asked. So we must understand that. Even for contemporary times, when we talk about movements, we must understand that women are there in workers' movements. They were there in the 1920s, 30s, in the general strikes, in the 1940s. There is, for instance, I have a diary of a woman worker from 1940s. It's a 40-page diary, and a hunger strike and a struggle that they launched. So, and there are autobiographical writings by people like Parvati Bai Bhor, various other women who were from the working classes also, who were not always the most literate. So obviously, if we're looking at personal narratives, you will look at Kulin women from Bengal, because who could read and write? How many women could read and write? So we must understand and be sensitive to the larger social context and reality when we draw on statements and generalize. As I said, colonialism, imperialism did not give women the luxury. Even as early as 1920s, when the Pratapgarh Kisan Sabha comes up, there is Kisan in Jaggi Devi. Deepti Mehrotra has written about it, and they submitted memoranda. They raised specific issues with regard to women's experiences. So what I'm saying is there's a larger history there, and that continues till today. I mean, for instance, if you look at the Chipko movement, if you look at Narmada Bachao Andolan, you look at workers' struggles, you look at trade union struggles in specific industries, the coir industry from pre-independence times, Meera Velayudhan's research is there on women's movement in Kerala. If you look at the unorganized sector, which is where a lot of struggles are happening, including so-called government scheme workers, domestic workers, the struggle for land and community resources to uh, keep community controls as more and more resources go into private hands. Women are there in all these struggles. If you look at the frontline workers, even during COVID, who are the Anganwadis? Who are the Ashas? They are the frontline health workers, and they are struggling. Whether those demands, whether their organizational perspectives emerge in the public domain, that is for us to ask ourselves. Where do we look? Where do we seek? But I mean, there's more than a crore of frontline health workers today who are in the midst of this, who have not sometimes been paid, who are vulnerable to both the health as well as other hazards in contemporary times. But what happens is, when we look, why am I raising this? Because when we think of women, when we think of gender, we think of a very narrow, specific agenda for women. So we'll think of it when we think of rape, we'll think of it as dowry, we'll think of it as domestic violence. But we forget that women's lives are constituted around their social existence, and it is through their experiences as women are mediated through these. And that is why the mass organizations of women in contemporary India have always tried to focus on what they call the multi-level spheres of oppression and exclusion and discrimination. For instance, ADWA is very categorical. It says we look at women as citizens, we look at women as members of oppressed class or social communities, and as women. So there are different levels with and spheres within which women face oppression. The whole migrant workers issue, for instance, today, unfortunately, again, it's only during the pandemic that women's migration also became an issue, partly because domestic workers, who are primarily drawn from sections of migrant workers and their families, uh, their entry was banned into middle class homes. So we suddenly became aware of the existence of a whole social class of women who were providing very crucial, critical services in our very own homes. But otherwise, what we find is, in the discussion on migrants, women and women's migration for work, not just as wives, not just as family members, but when they come to those cities, or even when they go into brick kilns, where they contribute very hard, back-breaking work. But somehow, and there they struggle also. If struggles happen there, and if struggles are planned and mobilized, these women also contribute to those struggles. But somehow, in the context of our categorization of gender, where we look at only patriarchy. And that brings me to a question, that what are the concepts, what are the frameworks within which we would look at women's oppression? And I'll come to that later. I would also say, before I go on to more specific aspects, that there is also this larger context of imperialism and feudalism. Just give me a minute. I will switch on the fan for a minute. Yeah. In this larger context, we must understand that, we may have gained independence, but it is not as if imperialism is dead and gone and finished with. It's very much there. if you are social scientist, you must identify the contemporary forms of imperialism, contemporary forms of imperialist interventions, and the impact on the daily lives of the Indian people, and more specifically on women. Globalization, for instance, is definitely a strategy of contemporary capital and international capital. And we must understand, I mean, just as if you are a student of history, you would know right from the Pope, who was issuing edicts and signing treaties as to where Portugal's boundaries would end and where Spain's would start, or when the Britain takes over. There are international institutions which act as and whose treaties and conventions act as instruments of ensuring that trade negotiations, etc., are conducted along certain lines, which in a sense draw the boundaries in favor of imperialism in contemporary times. And there's enough written about that. What we need to understand is that the net result of this larger environment leads to growing inequalities. There is enough evidence. There is Piketty's book. In India, we have enough evidence. There is Kannan's book also. There are the ILO reports. There are any number of human development reports which have talked about the inequalities. Now, why do we talk about it? You may feel, what does this have to do with women? Even if you look at the human development reports for South Asia, or the UN reports from 1995, from Beijing onwards, you will find that there is a clear documentation and clear evidence to say that inequalities have increased. The inequalities have increased between nations, between regions, within nations. And I think if anyone was keeping their eyes shut to that social reality, the pandemic should have absolutely glaringly pointed to what is going on. I think the condition of the migrants, the condition of the agrarian economy in India and women in these regions is a very, very clear statement on what happens when inequalities increase. And those are then reflected in the statistics. Now, if we look at women and women's statistics related to their status, there is a lot out there today. We have, for instance, the women's role in a planned economy, which Maitri has written about. I've also written about it. Others have written about it, which was a report prepared by the Indian National Congress's National Planning Committee before independence. We also have Towards Equality, which is a report which in a sense gives us a stock taking of the first 25 years of independence and women's lives in independent India. The Towards Equality report, as we call it, with which my very, very senior colleague and the founder director of the institute where I was, Bina Mazumdar, was located. Towards Equality report is still relevant. Even today, if you look at its chapters on demography, economic participation, law, many of those aspects are still relevant. If we look at what are the continuing issues through this period, from pre-independence times, we find political representation. Some of the biggest and most articulate mobilizations by women in India, as well as by Indian women in a sense, an international platform, not an international platform, but in an international location. For instance, during the roundtable conferences, etc., the whole discussion on women's suffrage rights took place. And it is there, you can see it from 1917 onwards, that discussion does not end till the Constituent Assembly debates. Anupama Rao has written about it, Anupama Roy has written about it, as well as, of course, many others. Gail Pearson has written about it. Gail Minow has written about Muslim women's mobilization for their rights, etc., which is something many of us tend to ignore, because there is a stereotype of the Muslim community that they've always been sort of depressed and they've never spoken out for them, which is not true, and there is a lot. But what I'm saying is some of the issues around which we see a continuity of concern by women who are active in the movement. One is in terms of political rights representation, which today has a different context. Then the domain of law, legal rights. From pre-independence times, we see discussion around community-based rights, both Hindus and Muslims, then in the Constituent Assembly, then around the first B.N. Rao committee, and then of course Ambedkar and the whole issue of the Hindu Code Bill. This is sometimes presented as, oh, Hindu community was willing to reform and Muslim community was resisting change. Let me tell you, the Hindu community was extremely backward and extremely resistant to change. And there is enough evidence of it. That evidence is there in the debates on the child marriage, the two select committees that were set up on the Sharda Bill and the Child Marriage Restraint Act as it finally came. The select committee reports show you what kind of representations were made. The debates in the legislature show that. Mrinalini Sinha has written at length, and so many others, Tonika Sarkar and all have written at length, giving you an idea about those debates and the kind of resistance to raising the age of marriage, particularly for girls. That is one discussion that you can see, but you must understand that that is still one of the few legislations we have which is in a sense a secular legislation, because the Child Marriage Restraint Act applies to all communities. In fact, as activists, we found that we invoked that clause when that whole question of Amina took place in the 90s. So, you know, those laws have relevance. It's not as if they have ceased to make any difference. Another, of course, larger domain, which is linked to law to some extent, is the socio-cultural rights and the whole issue of community rights, family law. And it is not as if these debates happened only vis-a-vis one community. These debates are, if you see the legislative assembly proceedings from the 1920s onwards, there is a lot of debate and there is a lot of crisscrossing and there is resistance. Uh, the issue of the Uniform Civil Code was always a contentious one. It was always posited as a demand, and yet there were different voices. And we saw that finally we got the Hindu Code Bill with lots of gaps, with many unanswered questions, etc. But it is not as if there was no resistance. The women activists who were my seniors in the women's movement used to give us very graphic, detailed accounts of the kind of attacks they faced when they were propagating and working in favor, mobilizing in favor of the Hindu Code Bill, and the kind of physical attacks as well as other levels of attacks. There was of course the Hindu Mahasabha women who were giving memoranda against the Hindu Code Bill reforms, and they are there in the records in the Teen Murti library if anyone has any doubt. Even amongst Muslim community, there were different voices. I think what matters is that the British, while legislating on Muslim laws in terms of marriage and the Shariat Act in 1937, 1939, they were actually out to woo the Muslim community as part of their larger political strategy, and therefore they played politics in that. There's a very detailed history there we can see. So that is where we are with regard to women. In independent India, we have to understand that yes, there were two challenges. One was how to build independent India and what were the platforms which were to be used. Women like Renu Chakravarti and some of the others who were representing people in parliament, they did volunteer and they did move certain bills for women, for instance, the whole Maternity Benefit Act, the Dowry Prohibition Act, etc. So this is in terms of law, but I think there was a larger struggle going on. We have to understand that there were two levels of struggle. So you first have independence. And there is the first flush of independence, hope, belief that things will change. And of course, there was still, even at that time, in fact, at that time, the primary opposition was the left, the communist parties, many of whom were in jail or in underground, or they were underground. So they were, in a sense, disabled from larger mass mobilizations. But when they were provided an opportunity, when they could find an opportunity, they did mobilize. And in fact, the National Federation of Indian Women was set up in 1954, as early as that, you can see, and it has consistently worked around women's rights. The history of the period from 1950s to 70s is very scantily written. Some material is there in Gargi's book, as well as if you look at the newspapers of the communist parties, etc. Now, we must understand that when we are talking about women's rights, I'm also talking about positive interventions with regard to women's rights. There were certain oppositional statements. So there were trends within Indian society which were opposed to these rights being granted, being recognized or accepted, leave alone being advanced. Sometimes you find politics and the sweep of politics changes in particular directions where those tendencies and those ideological formations may gather more strength, may gather more voice, and those contradictions come out much more sharply in society. But I think the real critical period for us was the emergency, which saw a huge resistance. People of my generation who were students during that period were exposed to the horrors of the emergency, including vis-a-vis women. And also for us, the energy of youth across campuses in India, and the political potential of youth and of women. I think it was the resistance against the emergency which opened our eyes to it. It also gave us the energy. We were infused with that energy and the confidence to posit issues differently. And that is why you find that post-emergency, there is a flush. So even though there were state level organizations as well as national level organizations prior to the emergency, but from late 70s, 78 onwards, you see a totally different scenario, which my generation really grew up in. We were part of that consciousness, we were part of that movement. I think it made us, it shaped us. Be it about the Mathura rape case, be it the whole campaign against dowry, which started with individual cases, but which then national level women's organizations took forward in a very coordinated way from the platform of the Dahej Virodhi Chetna Manch. Now, this period has been written about at length. I myself have written, you may see a Teen Murti volume in which I have written a paper with Rajni Palriwala on these movements against dowry, on the whole issue of sati, on the Muslim Women's Bill, which were three big issues which emerged in the 1980s in front of the movement. And even though I am writing about it from my location in Delhi, the fact is, I can say that both the campaign against rape, which of course was an all India campaign with huge mobilizations in Bombay, Maharashtra, and in the South. Dowry had seen huge mobilizations in Hyderabad before the emergency under the Progressive Organization of Women. On issues of caste, you can read about huge sort of struggles as well as debates, particularly in the South. And we must understand what that means, because because southern India has a different history of social movements, and the anti-caste movement is extremely strong. In North India, the reform movement was by and large in the shape of Arya Samaj, which did not take up an anti-caste stance in a very clear, radical way. It embraced women's rights, but it did not embrace women's rights from a very radical perspective. It was still within the domain of reform. But the question of caste comes up also in North India in the 1970s because of a very, very deep agrarian crisis, which we first saw in the 1970s, and massive attacks on poor, rural, landless, and including in the form of sexual assault on women. So the earliest, let us say, demonstrations or activities which we participated in, generation of students, were often around, I mean, I still remember some of the names. There was Arwal, there was Paraspiga, then in 1980s, there was the Pararia rape case. Now, these are all involving rural, landless laborers and agrarian struggles, attacks by the upper caste armies. There was a Ranveer Sena, I remember we talked about, and where Dalit women also faced a direct attack in the form of sexual assault. And this is all documented. There are judgments and pretty bad judgments also. You can see on the Pararia rape case, if you read the judgment, you'll be shocked. I mean, some of the things which you were hearing in more recent times are all there. So that is what we are talking about. Of course, post 1980s, we see the NFIW, of course, still is there, very much active, and the All India Women's Conference. There is the All India Democratic Women's Association, which was earlier there in state units in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, in Bengal, but emerges in 1981 as a national level women's organization and soon becomes the largest women's organization. There is the All India Progressive Women's Association. There are the organizations that we hear of till today, like Sri Sangharsh, Karmika, Saheli, Sabla Sangh, the forum in Maharashtra, of course, Jagori, and after 80s we see a mushrooming. I mean, I'm maybe losing out or leaving out many because I can't possibly, but we see a whole gamut, and both at the state level and a lot of newsletters, publications, a lot of knowledge coming up, a lot of knowledge building through these localized initiatives sometimes, or very specific initiatives. For instance, the Saheli newsletter will give you a lot on reproductive health rights of women. So with the groups focusing on specific aspects, their publications, their pamphlets, their interventions, Saheli intervened in the court on the whole question of contraceptives and harmful contraceptives for women, etc. So that's a much bigger issue. From the 90s, what we find is two things begin to emerge, because I mean, as I said, you have to always contextualize women's struggles. So it's not, while there are certain persistent problems, I mean, dowry, for instance, doesn't seem to go away. It's there. Pre-independence women's organizations are talking about it. We may still be talking about it. But there is also a changing sort of larger political context. So from 90s onwards, particularly we look at 1995 in the preparations to Beijing conference, to the Fourth World Conference on Women, you find two issues start, which also bring organizations together. So even though there are differences in perspective, we have seen from 1980s onwards sustained interventions on behalf of came to be called the Seven Sisters, seven national level women's organizations, having differences in perspective, having differences in terms of strategies to be adopted, having differences in terms of political perspectives, nevertheless agreeing to for coordinated campaigns on the issue of dowry, Sati, the Shahabanu, with differences also, but also common actors. But in the 90s, and of course also I forgot to mention one of the earliest interventions in 1980 was on the sixth five-year plan, where women's organizations and CWDS took the initiative, went to the Planning Commission and said, what is there in your plan for women? What are you specifically talking about planning? And if not, then why not? Why do women not feature in your policy and planning? So this critique of official policy, critique of state policy, not from a negative perspective, but saying your policies must be gender sensitive. They have to take women's experience in. And that is why you will find the sixth five-year plan is the first plan which has a chapter on women. And Professor Swaminathan actually held discussions with activists in the Planning Commission. I remember from 1980s onwards, these discussions happened, and they led to an understanding being developed in the 1980s that nearly at least say 40% of budget allocations for welfare schemes and poverty alleviation schemes would be targeted at women. Now, there was a big debate. I had letters in the CWDS files with secretaries from ministries writing, saying, how can we do this? This will destroy the household. This will destroy the family. How can you target women? How can you give allocations only for women? And this was argued out. So what you see later as the 33% reservation in the 73rd, 74th Amendment actually first was pushed as a strategy in terms of economic resources, welfare schemes, poverty alleviation schemes, saying not just household, but also put money in the hands of women, make them responsible and draw them into the development and planning process, into the economic process. Now this bears fruit. And in the 90s, you find three things happening. One, of course, in the political domain, there is a process of increasing, advancing fundamentalism. Now, that is a big issue staring the women's movement and fundamentalists of all communities. We had seen it on Shahabanu, we had seen it on Sati. So it's not as if one community was raising fundamental voices. No, all communities, I'm saying it. There's no time, otherwise I would talk about it. Even on dowry, the women's organizations faced a contempt case and we were charged with contempt in the Delhi High Court for having protested against a judgment which said that dowry is a custom in India, amongst the Hindus. And we said, you can't be sanctifying dowry in the name of custom. And we were charged with contempt. We faced it also. So, but by the 90s, fundamentalism had a different phase. It was on a different scale, and it had a role and clear expression and articulation in the political domain. But two other things which happened in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, we had the whole Mandal Commission mobilizations, which brought caste into the forefront in our political debates. And it is with that whole discussion that we find that from the mid-90s onwards, issues of Dalit women, then Dalit voices more categorically, which were there earlier, which were there prior to independence also. But now from the late 90s onwards, a very clear articulation of Dalit women's rights. But a third common, which bound a lot of women's organizations and activism together, was the impact of globalization, because the adverse economic impact of globalization began to show and reflect in the lives of women. Now, this is something very tricky because this is across the world. We have to understand that Beijing was huge energy. People still talk about the vibrant and the perspective, the platform for action that came from Beijing. But you must understand that the Beijing PFA is totally rooted in a perspective of globalization. It's talking about managing globalization. It's telling the UN agencies also now manage this globalization. It is not opposing globalization. So we have to see that larger context of how today a lot of your international structures of governance and national structures of governance are framed within the Bretton Woods institutions, and this has seen growing inequalities, which Stiglitz, Piketty, and Waldenbello, many others have written about. Where are we today? You'll be surprised to find that those issues which we were talking about in 25, 30, 40 years ago, adverse sex ratios, much worse, much worse. So if we were earlier talking about sex ratios which were adverse for girls and women in the range of 950 to 970, 927 at times, but today at district levels, if you go to block levels in some parts of North India, we're looking at sex ratios which may be between 6 to 700. The situation has become extremely alarming. And the CSWI towards equality had first drawn attention to adverse sex ratios, and now we talk more specifically in terms of child sex ratios. On the education front, we have to say we have made gains. Where we will stand after the pandemic, it's a big question. I'm sure all educationists are on the lookout for what the pandemic will say in terms of girls in the higher age group, particularly adolescent age groups. How many will remain in school? How many will drop out? What will happen to them? We still don't know. It's an unfolding situation. Otherwise, yes, in education, even though gender gaps are there, but education has been a slightly more positive story. The most alarming story is with regard to women's work. From 1921 onwards, and towards equality had first pointed to the declining work participation rate of women. But with globalization, we are very clear. The last from 1957, from 2005, 2007, if we start looking at NSS data, and my colleagues Indrani Mazumdar and Neeta have written at length. Ashwini Deshpande has written at length now on it. Jayati Ghosh has written it. But women's work is absolutely declining. Absolute. I mean, in numbers, in percentages, in rural India, it's a very sorry state. And then we have some brilliant economists who write in newspaper columns and say, oh, women are withdrawing voluntarily from the workforce. I mean, come on, tell us another joke. I mean, look at women's condition. So there are several aspects with regard to women's work. One is the invisibility of women's work and women's unpaid work. But what my colleagues are talking about is not just unpaid work, not just invisibility of work, because that we have engaged with. We've engaged with the census in the 1970s. We've engaged with the statistical organizations, how to change categories of SNE, etc. But there is a visible decline, and I think today we're talking about some 23% women in the workforce, 17% maybe in rural India. Ashwini has the latest data and it's there on the internet. It is an alarming picture. So anything that we talk about with regard to women's status, condition, rights, please keep this in mind. And what the pandemic may do and may have done, the newspaper reports point to declining further loss of jobs and loss of incomes with regard to women. When it ends, for instance, migrants are coming back now, it is reported. How many women will get these jobs back or will get new jobs? It's a big question. Linked to that is what we call the larger context of what grips our mind all the time. If you're watching television, whether it's Hathras, whether it's Balrampur, whether it's Unnao, whether it's Kachua, whether it's Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, wherever you go, the whole issue of crime in India and violence. So violence, we must understand, there are different levels, scales, and spheres of violence. What we need to understand is the underlying sort of links. So, urban India as well as rural may see random violence. You know, any woman walking down the street may be vulnerable. But in rural India, particularly, and otherwise also, we must understand in urban India also which women are more vulnerable to violence, and there we find it is women from the economically weaker sections of society. Very often also the women are drawn from Dalit communities. In specific situations like in Manipur, it may be the northeastern women. We all know the Manorma incident and the whole protest around that more than 15 years ago. We know how conflict situations such as Kashmir, etc., make women particularly vulnerable, how caste conflict makes women particularly vulnerable. So, what we are talking about is how social conflict uh, has its roots in structures, in social structures, hierarchies, and in inequalities. And there are structural roots of violence. So when, say, development happens, and development means a highway being built and families lose their land, and then they are on the road, they're on the streets. I mean, I've met families in the Raurkela area who have lost and been displaced 4 times. When the Hirakud Dam, when the Raurkela plant, and now they were fighting against POXO. I mean, four times, and no adequate rehabilitation. So the vulnerability of families, where women then are specifically vulnerable to sexual exploitation, trafficking, etc. So we have to keep these larger linkages. I've written about it many years ago in the social development report, which Zoya Hassan edited on contextualizing violence. And you must understand that to get that data also the movement has to struggle, because we didn't get any crime data against women in any very specific organized manner. It is only after the movement raised the issue of dowry, only after the movement in Haryana, for instance, more categorically raised the issue of honor crimes, that you start getting statistics around. So from the mid 90s onwards, you have the NCRB data, which is by and large reliable in the sense that of reported incidents. What goes unreported, which is not reported or recorded even by the police establishment. We all know how long it takes to lodge an FIR, be it Hathras or anywhere else. So all those factors apart, what is reported, what is recorded of that NCRB gives us a picture, and the picture is definitely very, very disconcerting. I mean, if there's anything to shock us, let us look at that data. And of course, the political participation debate has been out there now for 25 years, since 1996, when the Gita Mukherjee Committee report was placed in Parliament on the whole amendment in terms of women's reservation. That debate has been out there. Nobody wants to own it. The parties on the left are slightly more supportive, but they are not in the commanding situation. The ruling parties definitely don't seem to have a commitment, although there are shifting positions. Hopefully, some will be more committed now. Um, uh, we have some good reports from the government. For instance, the Justice Verma Committee report was useful, interesting. But now, of course, we are to come towards the end. Let's look at the pandemic and the future. Let's face it, the situation is very, very critical. It is particularly critical in terms of issues of food security. Now, a lot of people will say, why women? Well, women put food on the table by and large, given the stereotypes. So, women's concerns about food security are more critical. I mean, they're more stressful also on livelihood security and, of course, physical safety and security. Where are we? There are any number of laws. The women's movement has really struggled. I can give you case by case what it put on the table and compelled state agencies. Nevertheless, we find that the state agencies are the biggest violators or the most consistent violators, apart from custodial rape, non-registration of crime, poor investigation, botching up investigation so that conviction doesn't happen. Everything is there out there. Then now we see a new strategy of narrative and counter narrative. It reflects in policy making, it reflects in the institutions of the state. So we fought for the National Commission of Women and for state commissions, then you get strange kinds of commissions and with no power. Firstly, the commissions don't have any power, they have no teeth. Then you have a whole new situation where today the whole rhetoric around nationalism, nationality, citizenship, religion, identity, I mean, all our freedoms, all our rights are going to be circumscribed within these categories. There's an issue there. So ultimately, where do we stand? In all communities, there is resistance to women's rights, whether it's Sabrimala, whether it's Haji Ali, whether it's that Pune Mutt, there is resistance. So there's resistance in terms of economic sphere, political sphere, and of course the social sphere, very directly. Uh, where do we stand? I would say two things. One is, let us understand that while patriarchy, for instance, is a running thread through women's experience of denial, but it is not a sufficient tool. You have to look at other concepts, other categories of analysis, conceptual tools to understand the full sort of depth of what and how denial and exclusion happen. Similarly, in research methodology, and in terms of ideology, feminism is a very, very key concept. And yet I have always found that in countries such as India, women's struggles cannot be bracketed and boxed within a narrow frame of feminism, which may be defined from other locations, because the intricacy and the interconnectedness of the different spheres of oppression and denial and exploitation is so deep, it is so complex, that to try and fit it within a feminist frame, I feel I have never found that frame sufficient to understand either the women's movement or the scale and levels of my own activism. So I would say there is no advance in India today, no social advance without taking the women's movement forward. But there is no way forward for women if democracy is not strong, if democracy is not alive and robust and vibrant. And therefore, the need for women to build alliances, both in terms of movement-based alliances with other social movements struggling within the frameworks of democracy to advance democracy, growing in different sections, growing in particularly the economically vulnerable sections, the socially marginalized sections, giving them voice and giving them the strength to articulate demands from different locations, defying sort of ruling ideologies, defying the hegemony of be it caste or class. That is the challenge. It's an individual challenge, it's a political challenge, it's a social challenge, but it's a challenge. And there is no way forward without confronting that challenge. I mean, there's a lot left to say, but unfortunately, I think I can see Shubha getting restless about time. So it's there for you. Yeah.
Can't thank you enough for this extensive deliberation on women's movement in India. In fact, it has been a very fruitful day for my colleagues and for my students. I now request Aditi to take up the questions, because we have got a number of queries from listeners and viewers from Facebook and Zoom. Yes, Aditi, you may start.
Yes, ma'am. So we have a few questions. I would like to start with a question by Mridula Sharma. She asks, while Gandhi mobilized the Dalit population in the national movement, many historical documents suggest that he was hesitant to include women in the enterprise. So where and how can we situate women in the independence movement?
You want me to answer, or if there is a similar question? Well, look, Gandhi is still a puzzle to historians. He's just there. If you read Gandhi on women, and CWDS had a whole publication, a volume edited by Pushpa Joshi called Gandhi and Women, which is very, very clear. I mean, you read Gandhi on women and you say it's just not radical enough. I mean, even to the, on the other hand, let me tell you, I have met women in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even early 90s who would swear by Gandhi's leadership. Now it's a puzzle. The way I look at it, and one of my first research papers in my training in history was on Gandhi and the non-cooperation movement. What I feel is that Gandhi had a different style. He often had conservative positions, including on women, and yet he had a strategy whereby he drew in different sections of society. I mean, there is no doubt that he was the most persistently talking about caste, okay, in the language of Harijans, which is not acceptable today, not at all to the Dalits. But he was talking about caste right through. He was talking about women. I mean, let me tell you, from 1919 onwards, from the non-cooperation movement, it was not one or two women. I mean, I have been in this movement for 45 years myself. I can tell you how difficult and yet how successful you can be in terms of mobilization. And yet, in say 100 years ago, to mobilize women on that huge a scale, it's not easy. And I think for him, nonviolence was a strategy. Apart from a principle, apart from a personal ethics and principle, it was a political strategy. It is true. If you are in the student movement, you will find if your movement gets too militant, some students will stop participating. He was very clear that non-violent movements, satyagrah, ahimsa, Swadeshi, these were strategies to mobilize women, and he succeeded. I mean, these women would swear by Gandhi. Till the 1980s, I have seen, and big leaders. Of course, he was resistant. I mean, he's on record. He said Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay cannot be the president of the Indian National Congress. She's a divorcee. She's this, that, and the other. So he combined elements of conservatism, which were reflective of the times that he lived in. People have talked about his relationship vis-a-vis Ba, all that. I mean, look, let's face it, the leaders don't come custom made to order to be radical on all fronts. They're not. These are the leaders you have. You have to look for their successes. You have to critique their failures. But I would say, I mean, whatever it is, I'm critical of Gandhi. I have never accepted the Gandhian ideology personally. But as a student of history, I have to reckon with his success. I have to reckon with his leadership. And I have to reckon with his immense ability to reach out to women and a range of women. So let us not be dismissive. I mean, we have to, and to take on the might of the British imperialism with everything. Of course, we all know the problems, whether it's his stance vis-a-vis violence and Bhagat Singh, whether it's vis-a-vis the left, whether it's vis-a-vis the worker struggles, the naval mutiny. I mean, it's all there. That's Gandhi, not leave alone all that. I mean, my first paper, I looked at the Bardoli resolution for which ended the non-cooperation. He's very clear. He's saying landlords are our brothers. Don't rise against the landlords. So what are the tenants supposed to do in British India? They're supposed to cooperate with the landlords who are exploiting them to the hilt. I mean, starving and exploitation of no mean order. But that's Gandhi. You have to, I mean, he's a puzzle. He is a puzzle, but we should not be dismissive because his leadership quality and the success, and nothing like succeeds like success. I mean, there's no doubt. Yeah.
Okay. Alia Qureshi asks, Ma'am, women participation in the Indian Parliament still stands at approximately 11%, while almost 50% of Indian population is women. Do you think it's about time that the long pending women reservation bill with respect to the Parliament is passed? And if passed, do you think that it will bring about a radical change in the implementation of various laws, which till now have only been paper tigers?
Well, there are no guarantees. You may have the best laws. I think the women's movement over the last 4 decades has contributed to some of the most comprehensive legal definitions of crime, of violence, of rights, including rights within marriage, outside marriage, divorce. But if, be it the judiciary, be it the executive, be it your state machinery on a day-to-day basis, if they choose to not abide by, I mean, if you look at any of your rape cases, any of the incidents, from A to Z, every aspect of the protocol, every element of the standard operating procedures is violated, and no action is taken. Verma committee, I mean, we were saying this for 30-40 years, but Verma committee has put it in black and white. I mean, these people are answerable, they must be held accountable, they have to be held accountable. But what can you do when you appoint a national commission for women and then make it answerable to the women and child ministry, whereas it actually should be vice versa? The women and child ministry should be answerable to the national commission for women for all its acts of omission and commission, or any other ministry for that. I mean, they cannot, the commission cannot summon the police. They can only refer it to them. They can only recommend or refer. What is the purpose of such a commission? And Subhashini Ali had resigned from the first commission on that count, saying it's a powerless commission. It has no powers. What is the point of being in this commission? She resigned way back in what, 93, or when was it? Saying it won't. So, on the other hand, should you then opt out of? No, we have to fight to get women in the parliament, but we should be clear that in a country where elections are so totally caught up with money power and muscle power, these are the two things on which are a large part of our politics, even within the democratic domain of elections, is operating. Now, women have neither, or they have to be proxied and co-opted into that. That is why do you think the women's movement has chosen to back the reservation bill? Because in Rajiv Gandhi's time, let us remember that amendment was brought. What was it called? I think the 68th Amendment Bill or something, of women in panchayats through nomination. And the women's movement rejected that bill, saying we've just gone through emergency, now we don't want to be co-opted through nomination. We accepted 73rd, 74th because it's through the election process. You may get reservation if the women sitting there in parliament say yes to everything that is going on. Then, I mean, you may then ask the next step, saying what kind of women, what kind of ideological positions, what kind of orientation. You take every challenge at its when you meet it. If we go by, say, academic writing, you have Anne Phillips' work, which talks about politics of identity, politics of representation, democracy. And I think all these are concerns. But when we support reservation for women in parliament or state legislatures, what we are saying is, I mean, at the most preliminary level, our legislatures must be representative and participatory. So if you have a parliament with no Muslims, if you have a parliament, thankfully we can't say no Dalits because you have SC/ST reservations. But without those reservations, where would we be? I mean, if different social groups and communities are not going to find representation within I think for the women's movement, the challenge is making our own movement more representative and articulating all these diverse and different concerns and different voices. It is only that that can ensure that the democratic process also becomes more vibrant and resilient. Otherwise, I mean, if left to ruling classes and ruling parties, not just one party. I mean, I'm talking about a set of ruling parties who represent the ruling classes. I mean, the capitalist class chooses which side to back. If it's A today, it may be B tomorrow, it may stay A tomorrow also. It's up to the capitalist class who they think will advance their agenda best. But left to themselves, they are not interested in an inclusive democracy. They are not in, they want the rule of power. It is for us as people, as students, as women, as a representative of different social classes and communities to ensure that democracy stays intact and it becomes more vibrant through participation, inclusion, and greater representativeness of the people and people's will. That's all I can say on this. I've written about it. I mean, there were 2, 3 frontline pieces I wrote when the Rajya Sabha, first when it was not passed, then Rajya Sabha when it was passed. They're on the net. 3 pieces I think I wrote on the women's reservation bill in frontline. Yeah.
The next question is from Rahul Sahai. He asks, a majority of pressing issues ensue from a structural integration such issues. How do these structures come to be? One would imagine that building a framework should be difficult, let alone building one for some systematic oppression. Would love some insight about this. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure if I've got this question. It is a bit general and abstract. If you're talking about structures, as I understand as a student of history, for me, structures represent like feudalism or what we may see of feudalism. Uh, Despite a market economy in terms of feudal power, what I would see as crony capitalism or the power of the corporate class, which is hegemonistic, uh, the huge challenge of the market economy and a kind of fundamentalism regarding the market economy, which is what globalization has brought in. So there is no other way to go. I mean, that's what international regimes are telling you in terms of international trade regimes. And that is what your national architecture for governance is moving towards. The UN has already moved towards that. It has moved in terms of its vision and its interventions from, I mean, the whole emphasis on terms like governance is in terms of managing societies, managing crisis, managing governance. The agenda that was set out at the dawn of independence and the Constituent Assembly debates leave you in no doubt. I mean, what equality meant, what equality was meant to be in terms of hierarchies and challenging hierarchies, embedded structures of inequality, the Constituent Assembly debates and what is referred to within that by Ambedkar as constitutional morality, the spirit of the Constitution, the essence of the Constitution is very clear. And anyone who tries to upturn that or argue differently is frankly not working in tandem with the spirit and that core of constitutional morality, because it talks about equality. What we find in our country is what historians like me would say is a semblance of bourgeois democracy. So you have equality on paper, but when there is inequality in society, to treat everyone as equal is itself perpetuating inequality. To my mind, that is what happens with women, that's what happens with workers, that's what happens with the landless. So there is a systemic underpinning of inequality within a system, whereas there is a semblance and promise of equality on paper within the law. Now, it is for movements to confront that sort of asymmetry, as some would call it, or the prevalence of a continued inequality, persistence of inequality, which is growing. And I can cite reports and papers, including from the EPW, which have documented growing inequality in India. And I think the pandemic laid it bare for all of us, even if we don't look at economics data, etc. So that's the macro picture. In that macro picture, without political consciousness in terms of mobilization around specific rights and movements, to think that this inequality will die or wish away, it won't happen. The question and the real challenge for us is, to what extent are agencies of the state, the executive, the judiciary, the legislature, are to what extent we can exercise pressure to ensure that these stay on course with regard to constitutional morality. Because the signs that we see which are disturbing is that commitment may be abandoned at those levels where individuals can only continue to fight or continue to write, debate. I mean, middle class people like us can only do certain things. Otherwise, it is people's struggles and people's power. That's the challenge. And that's the challenge for women to identify who stands with them. Who should they, I mean, I have never been a votary of distancing from politics, because I think every struggle on women's issues is a political struggle, both in terms of day-to-day mobilizing, how you frame your memoranda, how do you frame your demand, how do you build movements, how do you build leaderships within movements so that they are not hegemonic and a top down approach. So every stage of it is political, but I think the level of politics gets deeper, and the challenge gets deeper, because it's not just India. I mean, it's across the world there is a crisis. And when capitalism is in crisis, there is a tendency, I mean, we all know what the Second World War was about. We all know what fascism was about. As a student of history, for me, it is not just individuals, but entire movements and entire historical sort of trends which seem to be moving in a particular direction, which are a matter of both concern as well as of they require deeper analysis, going beyond persons and personalities, in terms of social forces, in terms of social classes, and the momentum of democratic movements. That is what I would say.
This is question from one of our Facebook viewers. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Mr. Ravinder Kumar wants to know why all the women empowerment program are targeted towards girls, while need is to counsel and straighten men. Inherent malady or intentional?
Well, I mean, to some extent, I agree with you. To some extent, I don't. I think there is a continued need to address women and to reach out to women and give them the confidence. I mean, if you think that the fallout of any event, be it Hathras or Nirbhaya, what it leads to within the family, how girls' movements are curbed. I've been a teacher of undergraduate students for more than 20 years of my life in Delhi, and I can tell you how these incidents in this overall context plays out in the lives of young women students on a daily basis. Anyone who interacts, I mean, the question is not, as in the movement we have always said, it is not a gender war. It is about democratizing society. It is about democratizing relationships and the social domain and the social sphere. So it is about equality. It is not about special rights for women. But yes, women need special organizing and special targeted outreach in order to give them both the confidence as well as the opportunity to avail of rights which may exist on paper also, but also reaching resources, committing state resources, public funds, public policy to this. to ensure girls, for instance, and young women get schooling. And all, I mean, everyone should get schooling. And I think we should be looking at the new education policy in that context. What does it mean in terms of advancing the goal of universal compulsory education in India? We need to be critical and we need to engage despite what politics and media may be saying. I mean, it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility as citizens. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our country, and we owe it to our forebears who fought for these rights. I mean, if we allow our rights to go out of our hands so easily, then we don't deserve it, frankly. I mean, people like us who are sitting in some comfort zone as compared to others who are more visibly deprived and on a more systematic basis who are deprived. But I think we do not, what is happening here is that we do not put institutions through scrutiny. So whether it's media, which will divide in a strange way and draw divisive lines where it's yes and no, no. I mean, it's not a question about whether I like a particular leader or not. That's not the debate. The government of India and state government should be committed and should be made to be committed and should be made answerable for the goals of the constitution. It has to be that way. It cannot be in terms of my liking A, B, or C. It isn't that. I may have my ideological preferences. I may have my ideological alignments. That's not the point. As far as the state and government and judiciary and the police and the machinery is concerned, they have to treat all citizens as equal and they have to provide equal opportunities. And I think if we were to commit ourselves to advancing that fight, I think we will be doing ourselves and our country a service by upholding the constitution. Because I mean, my point is, whether or not education is there, why should every child born in India not have education? Why should? My question is, of course, we need reservation because even without that, even that much will not be done. But our country and our people should be committed, and our government should be made to be committed to universal compulsory education. I mean, what's to prevent us from ensuring that? And we don't have the resources for that. It's just that we choose to commit those resources elsewhere. That's all. And I think the people of India have to make our governments answerable. I mean, what is to say that I go to report a crime in a thana and my complaint is not to be recorded? I'm asking you. I faced it as a young activist. I've gone with young women on to lodge complaints, and I've been asked, क्यों पति क्यों झगड़ा करता है? तू किस लिए तू खाना नहीं बनाती हो कि अरे? I mean, I'm talking about domestic violence, and you're asking me why this husband beats this woman. Am I answerable for that? The woman has a right to dignity. The woman has a right to a violence-free domestic life and a violence-free social life. And the state should be committed to that. Rather than finding reasons as to why men beat up women, I mean, what the hell? Or trying to argue, as some did, that should we open liquor shops, and then there's a debate going on during the pandemic, how to get excise duty, how to get funds. I mean, is domestic violence going to be an issue in terms of whether you are going to provide liquor or not? And whether you want to raise your resources through sales of liquor? So these are larger debates, and we need to conduct them with an open mind, without prejudice, without stereotypes, and be frank and open about it.
This last question, I think we are ready to conclude the session. But before that, let me tell you, ma'am, there are numerous compliments and remarks and thank you notes for you for giving such an extensive lecture. And there is this long thing, I can't, yeah. As you know that there's Saurav Rohila. I'll just take it up since it is too long. Let me see what does it all talk about. as you know, that the idea of modern feminism can be traced to origin in US, be it the idea of radical feminism or Kate Millett's writing coming out from New York protests. But as far as political representation is concerned, can we still call our political setup patriarchal? Because in the last 200 years, America never had a woman president. But in India, we see the tenure of a strong Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, democratically elected by people of India, while D.K. Barua going far to say India is Indira and Indira is India. Also, ma'am, how did the reversal of Shah Banu judgment affected the course of women's movement? Because we never had a reversal of Supreme Court's judgment due to pressure from Muslim Personal Law Board and Muslim community, but we see the Hindu Code Bill early since independence. Can we also still call the Hindu community resistant to change? This is, I mean, the 2-3 matters are mixed over here. Maybe you can take a
Yeah,
call.
it's a lot of mix. So I don't know if I can take, because there's something about feminism in the US, then Shah Banu, then Borua and
Yes.
psychophancy. I mean, let me make my position clear. I do not believe in psychophancy. I would never stand up for psychophancy for A, B, C, any leader. I think all of us give critical support to political decisions, and it has to continue to be critical. Okay, and there has to be a continued engagement. As far as the Shah Banu issue is concerned, the women's movement that I have been a part of, and I have been a part of much of all this, we were very clear. We did not stand for the reversal of the Shah Banu judgment, even though there were statements within Chandrachud's judgment which had some, there were issues. But we stood for Muslim women's right to maintenance under Section 125, and we spend, I can tell you, I can even give you the dates if you want, from May 1985 to the 5th of May or the 6th of May 1986, when the Muslim Women's Bill, as we called it, was passed. We spent more than a whole year mobilizing Muslim women and the women's movement in general around that issue, and we had a very clear argument on it, and we adhere to that argument. I still stick to it, because Chandrachud's judgment gave maintenance to Shah Banu under criminal law under Section 125, and the organizations that I have been a part of were very categorical in saying that Section 125 was under criminal law, which is a secular law. It was not under Muslim personal law, and there was no question and no reason for the Rajiv Gandhi government to intervene and to have reversed that judgment. We were very clear in our opposition, and many of the organizations challenged that bill in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court judgment, it was a constitution bench which went against and rejected our plea, but we petitioned. We do feel, and I want to say it because I've been an activist, it was absolutely, I mean, tragic, you can say, it was naive, whatever you may say, of Rajiv Gandhi to have done the same thing in the same month. The gates of Babri Masjid were opened in February 1986, and the Shah Banu reversal bill, the Muslim women's rights of the maintenance, whatever it's called, the 1986 bill, was introduced in Parliament in early February 1986. Both were disastrous. Both were disastrous, and they have determined the course of politics in India in no small way. The question is that secularism is not a balancing act between religions. Secularism is a constitutional principle, and you abide by it or you don't abide by it. I think when political exigencies drive governments to making compromises for their political reasons, I mean, the women's movement is certainly not a part of it, and the women's movement should not be a part of it. The women's movement should judge all these decisions and issues on its own, on each issues merit and take its position. I can tell you that there was no confusion on this. We were very clear. I think we gave more than 10,000 signatures by Muslim women saying retain section 125 CRPC because it is in the criminal law, and criminal law is not personal law. It is not along personal lines, etc. And that is our position even on the Uniform Civil Code. Our position is that Uniform Civil Code should not be a shortcut to implement and impose a Hindu code bill on everyone else, or from a majoritarian perspective. What we are talking about is not balancing between communities, which politicians may wish to do for their own reasons, but the women's movement is very clear that all women in India should have their rights as per the Indian constitution. I may enjoy those rights under the Hindu code bill, I may enjoy those rights under Muslim personal law, but I must have equality in my private life, in my public life, and that should be as per the Constitution of India. As far as the Muslim Personal Law Board is concerned, the Muslim Personal Law Board, at least the women's movement, does not recognize it as the sole spokesperson or authority for the rights of Muslim women. It does not. It has not represented. Women have struggled and engaged with the MPLB also at several levels, not once. I mean, there have been fiery meetings with women standing outside and saying, will you discuss this or not? They forced them to bring out a nikahnama to discuss it. But look, let's face it. In Hindi, we have that word mahant. There are mahants and mathadis in all religious communities, whether it's in Christianity, which may oppose certain things. Even when the Pope is saying something different, they will say, no, we in India are so and so, So all communities, and in Beijing, let me tell you, the most visible were the tents of all the fundamentalists of all communities. So there is an anti-women, there is a patriarchal streak in all religious communities. It is reflected in the stand that the leadership of these religious communities take. And I think if we are going to hold democracy in India hostage to negotiations on the basis of communities, I think it's a sure recipe for disaster. Let's abide by our constitution and uphold it and ensure that the governments of the day are answerable to upholding the constitution. The women's movement is very clear. We may want to go beyond the constitution, but we will not certainly stop at anything below the constitution. That is a consensus document as far as the debates of the late 19th, early 20th century go, and we will not accept anything which compromises those rights of equality, freedom, and democracy. That we are very clear, and it's not for me. I mean, I'm no spokesperson of anyone today at my age, but I think the women in India, my experience for the last 4 decades and more with the women across class, across castes, across communities tells me I have confidence that even though we may be seeing dark days, but there is a bright future ahead, because these women are not going to stop. You give them one little chance and they fly because they have the capacity and they have the aspiration for equality, like all Indian people. And I think that's their right. I don't see anyone, be it Muslim Personal Law Board, just as I don't think any Mahant is a spokesperson for faith and religion. They may represent specific trusts, they may represent specific trusts and monuments or whatever, but they don't speak for, who's going to speak for the community? I think the Constitution of India speaks for all our rights as citizens, more than anything else.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for increasing sensitivity on this subject. And we are extremely grateful to you. And if one has to conclude, one can say that despite over 100 years of history of women's movement, I think the rights of women and girls is still the unfinished business of the 21st century. Several steps have been taken, but a lot still needs to be done in order to ensure health, employment, and wages, and legal rights, law reforms, and safety, security at the workplace, and freedom from violence, all kinds of violence, and political participation for women in the highest levels of decision, and so on. And with these words of hope and positivity, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for the bottom of my heart, for throwing so much of light, for throwing ample light on the history of women's movement and the terrain you have covered through your thought-provoking lecture. And thanks for sharing your expansive knowledge with us. And before I sign out, I just need to extend my gratitude for the college, for our honorable principal, who is like wind beneath our wings, and always encouraging us to go for such, enlightening sessions, and the IQAC and the webinar committee, and last but not the least, Rahul, Aditi, Komal, Swati, for having taken a great deal off my shoulders, and I truly appreciate it. And thank you, lovely audience, one and all, and it was pleasure having you here, and with your attendance, the session could be so memorable and also incredible. So it has been a wonderful experience today, and Nimbus is planning more sessions, so all of you stay tuned. In fact, on the 7th of November, Nimbus is bringing an international conventional debate, so all of you are invited to participate over there. And thank you so much, ma'am. I've been from the beginning to the end. I think I owe it all to you.